Hello. So glad that you are listening in and being part of this recording. Last week we had a big ceremony, so I couldn't. It wasn't appropriate to send that recording out to various emails because private personal things were being said. We had a bit of a midsummer party. So I've now have a moment, and I'm going to give you the rendition of the Thor stories. One of the things that I would like to just open up with is the context and where Thor comes from, really, his origin, his lineage. And his lineage is that we have to go back all the way to Ymir, who, as you remember in the creation myth, gives birth to Mimir, which is memory. And memory had many daughters, particularly one which is Night, N-A-T, Nut, and she had many husbands. One husband was Anar of the waters. The night and the waters came together and they had a child, which was a daughter named Jud. Jud is our earth, the giantess. And she very much had a beloved who we called Odin. And sometimes he's spirit, the all-father, the great spirit in some ways. And or the great all-fathering spirit. And he, with Jud, fathered, and Jud gave birth to a son named Thor, the son of the earth, the protector of the earth, and therefore the protector of humankind, often the protector also of farmers, of crops, and all of those things. He brings blessings. But for crops to be protected, for blessings to be had, for all those things, he often becomes a bit of a god of order. But funnily enough, he's half giant, so he's also unpredictable with his anger. That's one thing that shows up. So this is now the story of Thor going to visit the land of the giants, particularly the northern part, and he's going to visit the king of the giants. In the sources, we don't really know the reason why he's going to see Utgard Loki. We don't know the why for that, but we know that Odin, that Thor goes towards the land of the giants often to look at the periphery in which we live in, the intersections between the land of the giants and the land of mankind, for example. So he's often within in that between world, in those liminal places. So the story begins, as it often does in Thor stories. The story begins that he is irritable and impatient, and he's waiting for Loki, because Loki and Thor are together going to travel to the land of the giants. I often wonder why Thor brings Loki to these adventures, but it is clear to me that every time he does, it ends up being for the best. Frankly, he cut the hair of his wife, Sif, in the middle of the night, drunk with the darkest meads, and he cut the hair of Sif. Funnily enough, it was that which gave Thor the hammer. So, there we go. What a marvelous thing that the tricksterish moves of Loki sometimes brings regeneration, brings growth. In a way, he moves the stories along, but at this point he's not. Thor is waiting for Loki to come. He's like, come on, we're going on an adventure, we're going on a quest. Just as he is about to, pull tighter his Megan belt of power and tuck his hammer in his belt and get ready with the two rams and his chariot to fly across the skies, he suddenly hears, Loki coming. Sorry I'm late, with his kind of iPad face, colors everywhere. You're never quite sure where his eyes are looking. Anyway, he joins Thor last moment. He joins Thor and they go flying across the skies. Now, before they go to the land of the giants, Thor decides to take a visit to the farms of Middle-earth. So he's flying in our world, and he particularly chooses a farm that is very poor, because as I said, he's a friend of the farmers, and he wants to bless this farm. So he knocks on the door, and Thor and Loki are probably trying their best to try not look, to look a bit like they are from the earth themselves. Often it's not a good thing when humankind sees the gods in their true forms. That can be quite very frightening and dangerous in some cases. So they kind of shape shift slightly, so they are more suited to the area, to the place that they're in. So they knock on the door, and the farmer opens, but he knows immediately. He gets onto his knees and he says, I have been praying for better rain. I have been praying, and now my prayers are heard. You are here, Thor, the son of the earth, and Loki. And he's beside himself. And as wilderness laws demand, of course, he has to house them, and he's delighted to. The only problem, of course, is that he has mainly a few measly potatoes lying around, half rotten. He doesn't have much food. The family has lived off from sort of scant soup for the past couple of months. They've had a tough winter. So it goes that Thor, he says, look, I'm going to provide the feast tonight. Loki's going to provide the wine, and I'll provide the meat. And he goes out and he slaughters his 2 rams, and he brings them back perfectly prepared, perfectly butchered, in all the right places, every single part of the ram. And he lays out the skins, and he just says this. He says, whatever you do, take care of the bones, treat them with respect, and put them on the skins afterwards, and enjoy the feasting. And with that, they drank, they sang, they had rosy cheeks on their faces, and the 2 children or adolescents that were with them, Röskva and Sjalfi, were absolutely delighted and joyful, and they couldn't believe the blessing of having gods coming to their own farm that had suffered greatly. But I'll say this, never again will that farmer have any trouble growing his crops. And for as long as he lived after that meal, he would have a full belly, a sound sleep, and good health. And that's what happened. And the next day, there's one little mishap. As Thor went up to the skins, he woke up, he said the runes. Ken gifuwinya hagalnaur isiera petra e algisul tu bjerka e madre lago in udal dagas fe. And he took his hammer. In fact, I have a hammer here. He took his hammer and he blessed the skins, and suddenly out of the air came the 2 rams. And he led them out of the house, and he saw that one of his rams were limping. Now, I told you about the anger of Thor. So often when things like this happen, he gets what's called the Megan anger. So it starts to rise, and the earth feel it, the clouds feel it, even the sun will sense it, the moon, everything, the world around. And it was no different at this time. When his anger rises, there's an electricity in the air, winds start to whirl up, there's hailstones coming down horizontally, and suddenly there's a thunder, lightning, and he's standing there holding his hammer and said, who have been mistreating my bone, the bones of Tooth Gnarler, which was the name of his ram. Walks into the farmstead, and the farmer and his wife are absolutely beside themselves with fear. But Sjalfi the son did a good move. He said, look, I did it. I'm so sorry. I sucked the marrow out of that bone. I was so hungry. I couldn't help myself that I might have cracked some of the bone. Just because he owed up to it, Thor said, fine, okay. And he looked at Sjalfi for a while, and he looked at him carefully. And he liked him. He liked Sjalfi. He liked Röskva. He saw that they were adolescents. And he said to them, look, he said to the parents, let's do a deal, right? I will take the children, or the teenagers, shall we say, and they will help me on a quest. And by doing that, they will learn about life. They will learn about many things, and I will teach them. They will encounter many things. And then when it's over, I will bring them back. All right. And this way I would leave the rams here to rest. I think Tooth Gnarler needs to have a time to just allow his bones to heal. And is that a good deal? And the farmer and his wife secretly, I mean, of course they will be sad to see their teenagers go in this way, but what better teacher than the son of the earth himself to take them to adventures. So so the deal was struck. The gilding is called the pavement when something happens like that. It's an old way of paying out some debts, and it seemed a great exchange. And what happens next was that Thor asked, "There's only one thing. As I can't take the rams across the skies on my chariot, is there a boat I can borrow? Or do we have to build one?" And the farmer said, "Yeah, there's a rowing boat out on the jetty. Out there you can take my rowing boat. The oars have just been oiled." And with that, they set off. They gathered some provisions. They took them with them, and 4 of them now, a group, Loki, Thor, Röskva, and Sjálfi, set off. And Loki and Thor both took turns, and they rowed across that sea. And they rowed and rowed, it seems for days they were rowing. They were rowing out into the dark, jagged, toothed waves. In the beginning it seemed fine for Sjálfi and Röskva, but after a while, when they're out there in the grey waters, suddenly the waves feel like they're made out of hills. And now, as they're approaching what seems to be the land of the giants, the waves too become giant-like. They are big as mountains now, frothed, and Röskva could even see a bit of scales in those waves, she thought, a strange fin moving. And as they rowed, they saw the little silhouette of land, and they felt mighty relieved to come out of this rowing boat after having had the waves splashing on them for what seemed like days. Certainly the sun rose and the sun went down a few times. And as they got to the beach, it was a strange beach. Shells, we're talking as big as the farm itself. The trees grew all the way to the clouds. And Sjálfi thought to himself, what would be the size of the wolves around here, or the bears? And out of the corner of his eye, Loki could see wings out there in the distance, big, big wings. But he didn't speak to anyone of it, not to scare them, not to scare the teenagers of Röskva and Sjálfi. And as they wandered off into the clouds, well, quite so, into the valleys filled with clouds and mist, as they wandered through the valleys, up mountains and through rivers, they were traveling north. Thor didn't quite know exactly where the palace of Utgard-Loki, or his big realm, his big castle, was situated. He didn't know. His halls, they were somehow to the northeast. That's all he knew. And none of them saw or heard any animals as they were traveling. It was eerily quiet, except the third night when they were trying to sleep. They were sleeping out under the skies. Suddenly the clouds had gathered and hails had started to come down. And in the land of the giants, those hailstones are as big as tennis balls, or even bigger, some of them. So they had to find some sort of shelter. And Thor led them into a cave-like structure that was in the valley. And there they slept. But in the middle of the night, they could hear this this rumbling from the earth. They couldn't figure out what it was. All of them were awake, terrified. And on the first light of morning, Thor went out, and then he saw one of the biggest giants he'd ever seen, and he'd seen a few. His head was on one side of the valley, and his entire body laid across the valley, and his feet on the other side, like a hammock, like he was lying in a hammock. And with that, he was snoring, and it was his snoring that caused all this earthquake. They couldn't believe it. So he went up to the giant and he thought, well, I'd better introduce myself. I am in his land anyway. So it's only courteous to introduce. So he went up to the ear of the giant and he yelled, "Wake up, wakey wakey!" And the giant opened his big eyes, turned his head, his eyes size of the moon, instantly recognized Asatur, that he's called often. "You are Asatur, I see, Redbeard, and you have come to the land of the giants. Quite some nerve. I know many giants who would like to wrap their hands around your neck, and many of them live with Utgard Loki." And with that, Thor was saying, "Exactly, and that's precisely where I'm going to see Utgard Loki." And he's holding his hammer. "Where are they? I want to meet them face to face." Skrymir laughed. "Well, you better grow a bit if you're going to go and see those giants, because they are mighty big, many bigger than me myself." And as he stood up, his head was up into the clouds and his body, and he stood there in the valleys, and he reached out and he grabbed this cave-like structure that they had slept in. And as he took it up, Thor realized that it was his glove that he had left there as he'd gone to sleep. And he grabbed this thing, and Sjalfi and Roskva and Loki all flew out of the fingers of the glove. And that had been the caves. And he just put it on his belt. And Loki and Roskva and Sjalfi were lying there in a heap, luckily not harmed. Thor was extremely, he was getting more, his Asa Megan, right? His Thor Megan was starting to rise, but he kept his cool. He kept his cool for now. And then he said to Skrymir, "Do you know where Utgard Loki lives?" And Skrymir says, "Yes, I can show you. I can show you. It's about a 2-day walk from here. And you will be there. I will leave you at dusk. And all you need to do is follow the trail to the northeast." And he pointed at some star constellations. "Just make sure you walk in their direction." And with that, he said, "Look, to make our journey easier, I'll take all your provisions, put it over my back, and you follow me. You will hear me through the woods, and you will see my head in the clouds. There's no chance of escaping me. So just follow me, and then and do the best you can." And with that, he took the provisions into his bag, threw it over his shoulder, and just started walking. And in one step, he was literally through the valley. And they had to just try and keep up, which they did. They did. But all the time, they saw Skrymir far, far in the distance. They saw this big, enormous body and head kind of wandering through the landscapes. Quite a sight, quite an image. And as they were wandering behind, when it got darker, Skrymir put himself down like he'd done before and lay down between the valleys and started snoring, and the ground shook. Thor thought nothing of it, so he grabbed the bag. He was hungry, Loki was hungry, everyone was starving, and they needed to eat. And he grabbed the bag, but he couldn't open the knots. He didn't have enough strength to open the knots of the strings of the bag. Now you've got to understand this. This filled Thor with great suspicion. There are very few things that Thor can't do, and one of them, well, not opening a lid or not opening the knots of a bag. It smells of some kind of strange witchcraft. So he started to get suspicious, and he became angry, and he grabbed his hammer. Now, as Skrymir was completely asleep, snoring, he thought it wouldn't be not bad to sort of hit him on the head a little bit to wake him up. So he hit him with the hammer. He opened one eye and he said, "Ooh," said in a kind of sarcastic voice, "Was that a leaf that fell on my head, Thor? Is that what I'm feeling?" And Thor was now, his Megan was starting to rise, the anger was starting to rise. And he held his hammer, and his knuckles were a bit white, holding the handle. And he turned around Skrymir and started snoring again. Now Thor was starting to feel his thunder coming, and he grabbed his hammer again, and he says, "I'm going to wake him up properly this time," and he smashed him on the head. And Skrymir opened both of his eyes and said, "Oh, there must have been a little acorn falling on my head. Is that you, Thor? Is that you throwing little acorn at me? What is the matter?" And he looked at Thor deeply, not without this strange kind of confrontational feeling that they both starting to have. And Thor felt utterly humiliated. What's going on? My hammer, like an acorn, I cannot open even the knots on a bag. What's happening? And then Thor said, "Look, we need some, what have you done with the bag? We need our food." And he says, "Oh, a child can open up the bag. Just give it a bit of a ruffle and you'll be fine." So he went back and he was trying to open up this bag. He just couldn't. They had to go hungry. And with that, he grabbed the hammer. He was now furious for the giant. And his big Megan was electric. He stood up and he hit the giant as hard as he possibly could on the head. And with that, he thought he would have killed him normally. But Skrymir just opened his eyes and looked at Thor and said, "There seems to be many acorns now falling on my head. Well, why don't you all go to sleep? See you in the morning." His snoring continued. Thor didn't sleep much that night. He kept guard. The others had a bit of a sleep until the morning light, and then Skrymir came, undid the knots, and they could have their provisions back. And then he walked with them about half the day, and said to them, "Okay, here we must part. You continue towards the east, continue towards those constellations you see up ahead, and with that I will leave you, and you will find, probably by the end of the day, dusk time again, you will find the realm of Utgard-Loki. But I will warn you with one thing. Don't try to be proud in a place like that. Keep your pride in check, because these giants are ancient and they don't like people with too many audacious acts." And he said, and the other thing to keep aware of, make sure you have something to show your prowess. Make sure you have something to show the giants, because without that you will not be allowed to be even in their presence. And then he went. So they grabbed their provisions and they started walking east. Not very shortly, the day passed, and as it happened, they saw the great spiraling tower of the king of the giants and his great halls. And they looked at them and they were in awe. I mean, the walls had dragon heads hewn into them. They were gates. They were iron gates the size of their arms or legs, twisted into all kinds of shapes. They were jewels around the walls. There was fierce feeling of magic around the whole place. And the spirals went far up beyond the clouds. They couldn't even see how high they were. And they walked towards, and they felt like little mice coming through the gates. No one was there, but they heard rumbling. Not the sort of rumbling they had heard from Ymir's snoring, more of a rumbling of laughter, and the whole earth was shaking around them. And as they moved in, they came to a banquet. Suddenly, a banquet of an enormous table of any food you can ever imagine, and they were all of the giants there, probably 50 or 100 giants sitting around, and on the throne there was the king of the giants himself, Utgard-Loki, with a beard tucked into his belt, with eyes as old as the universe. And he saw them with his beam of an eye, saw them moving into the banquet, and he could see who was leading their little troop. Asa Thor, the red beard, and he laughed. "Look who's coming to see us.
Thor is amongst our halls. And all the giants just went, look at him, look at him. And they started to laugh at them as they moved like little mice across, underneath the mead benches and towards the throne. And Utgard-Loki said, "You have come to receive our hosts, to receive our great. You come to dine and feast with us. You have come to the land of the giants, Thor. This is a place where I would not expect you to come into my halls, into my place. Well, no one is allowed to be here unless you have a great skill. No one can drink from my horns or eat my food unless there is some genius inside of you. So show yourselves. What can you do? What is it that you can do so you can be under the roof of my halls?" Now Loki was clever. Yeah, they hadn't since the sea journey, since their troubles, they hadn't had much to eat. Loki was actually starving. So at this point he said, well, he said to Utgard-Loki, although you are all very big and undoubtedly have large appetites, but no one can eat as fast as me. So I will challenge anyone to an eating competition. And with that, he thought he had two flies with one blow, right? He was starving, now he's having an eating competition, and he'd seen the food on the table of the banquet. It was world finest meats and the finest food you could ever imagine. So with that, they set up a table and they put all of the food on it. And then there was one giant, a bit of a average size, and his name was Loge, or Loge, and he was on one side of the table. The other side of the table was Loki. And then with that, Utgard-Loki blew on his bugle, blew on his horn, and said, all right, begin. Loki ate all of the food in a second. He had devoured all kinds of meats. He had drank all the wine. He had eaten everything. But Loki, he had eaten all the food about the same speed. But he had also eaten the entire table. He had also eaten all the bones of all the food that lay there, and he was clearly the winner. Well, is that all you've got, Loki? Will anyone else show for yourselves? And then Shalfi looked at Thor and Roskva, and he thought to himself, well, where I come from, no one runs as fast as me. No one can run as fast as me. So I will challenge anyone to a running competition. So with that, they decided to go to the courtyard, so go outside, and all the giants rose up. You can imagine this enormous hall. There would probably be even stars above it. And there they walked outside, and as they got out, they saw everywhere these big fields. And on those big fields, they have the golden oxen, the beautiful golden oxen, something that you rarely see except in Jotunheim, the livestock of the giants. And on these great fields, they decided to lay out a track. And then Shalfi got ready for a sprinting competition. And the person he was running against was a youthful giant. The name of the giant was Huge, Huge. And like huge, but it's spelled Huge. And for those of you who know the word, and we are there, and they decided, they got the distance, and they said, okay, on 3. 3, 2, 1, go. Ready, steady, go. Bang! And they started. And Shalfi was indeed extremely fast, but he'd barely gone halfway. Then Hugh had beaten him to it. So he decided to do another length. He said, well, look, maybe can we do 50 yards instead of 150 yards? Maybe I'm faster with 50 yards. So Shalfi and Hugh stood side by side and again started running. He had barely put a foot forward before Hugh had already covered the distance. Not very good, said Utgard Loki. Not very good. I'm not sure you are worthy of staying in my halls. But surely you, Asa Thor, surely you are the one to show us what prowess and what strength you have here in the land of the giants, so we can respect you and you can eat with us under our halls. Well, Loki had already gone for the food. Now Thor said, look, no one can drink me under the table. No one can drink more than me. So I challenge anyone to a drinking contest. Anyone. And he looked around, and there indeed was the giants, and they were enormous, and their horns were enormous. And Utgard Loki said, we love drinking competitions. So we will find a horn for you. And with that, they brought out this horn, an enormous horn. You couldn't even see how big it was, right? It was so big, and no one could see the end of it. And he brought the horn to Thor, and he said, well, here, most of us can drain this in two goes. The biggest ones of us, they can drain it in one. But very few of us can drain it in three. Most of us can drain it in two. So he gave the horn to Thor, and he said, all right, well, I'll show you. And he grabbed the horn, and he took it to his lips, and he lifted it, and he drank, 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 until he couldn't breathe anymore. And he thought, okay, this would have done it. But when he looked at the horn, he realized that in fact, the mead, which tasted salty, had just gone down a tiny, tiny bit. Barely anything recognizable. Certainly hasn't even made an impact. And he thought, that's strange. Okay, well, let me try the second time. And he grabbed the horn and he drank and he drank and he drank and he drank and he drank. Again, when he got it back, just a tiny, tiny bit. Nothing. Aha, Utgard Loki said, well, all of the other giants laughed at him as he was doing this. He felt humiliated again. That same kind of Thor energy started to come in. He's starting to feel his anger, and he grabbed his hammer and he thought, well, I'm not going to fight them in their own halls. But almost he was ready to spring upon them. Then he said, well, I could lift anything. In the world of the gods, I'm one of the strongest. I can lift any weight you give me. And then with Utgard Loki mentioned, he said, well, many of our giant children here lifts our old cat, so you can try and lift her. And out came this big grey cat, looking suspiciously at Thor. And Thor went up to the cat and just, feeling already humiliated, but he was going ahead with the challenge, So he started lifting the cat, and he lifted and he lifted, and one paw lifted from the ground. That's it. He couldn't do it. Now he was furious. I'll fight any of you, he said. Come on, challenge me to a duel, challenge me to a battle, and I'll fight any of you. A wrestling match. Great, he said. Why don't you have a wrestle with our old crone, Ellie, our ancient grandmother? And in came the crone. She had a walking stick as she walked in. Grey, long hair. She looked as ancient as the universe itself, as older than the moon and the sun. And as she was looking at Thor, he came up to her and she grabbed him straight like this by the neck and pushed him down. And there was nothing he could do. Just like when he tried to do those knots from the bag. Simply nothing he can do. And he stood there and the legs were bent and he was trying. And then, Utgard Loki said, stop. And with that, the old matron, Ellie, shuffled away on her walking stick. Utgard Loki, he suddenly felt charitable. he said, okay, for just this one night, you're allowed to stay over here in my halls, but the next day you must be gone. You cannot be here for longer as my guests, as you have not proven yourselves worthy. So they stayed and slept on the mead benches in the halls of the giants, and they slept there surrounded by the snoring and you can imagine the belching and all the noises from giants. It was deafening. The next morning in the light of day, Thor decided that maybe it was time to return. He had seen enough. He suspected something. As he walked out of the great halls, Utgard Loki came to see them goodbye, say goodbye, and he stood there with his beard tucked to his belt, his head up in the clouds, an enormous body, and he leaned down towards Thor, and he says, Thor, if I had known how powerful you are, you would have never been allowed in to the world of the giants. I will tell you something, and I will tell you a secret before you go. That sack that you tried to open, that sack was bound by iron, thick iron, and I had put a spell on it. So you had been an illusionary spell. You had thought that these were ropes, but indeed this was iron that has been spellbound not to move. Another illusion you have fallen for, Thor, is that when you hit me over the head with your hammer, do you see all the new mountain ranges that have just sprung up there in the horizon? He was pointing out to the mountain ranges. But each time you hit my head, you created 9 more valleys, and goodness knows how many valleys more, which I still haven't seen, but these are the ones there you can see in the distance. Now Thor was getting his anger back again, and he was holding his hammer, expecting trickery, more trickery. And he said, and you know, the challenges. Well, Loki, he is indeed someone who carries a lot of hunger inside of him. But he was eating against wildfire, Logi. And wildfire, no one can eat more. No one is greedier than fire. Or nothing can withstand fire when fire becomes wild and hungry. And Sjalfi, he had to run against something that is the fastest in the whole of all the worlds. And it's thought. Thought is the fastest thing we know. And Logi was the personification of thought. Nothing is faster than thought. And then he said, and you Thor, when you drank from that horn, when you were drinking, we realized that we brought the horn into all the great circling oceans of all the worlds. And as you drank it, the tides have now begun. And you have created all the tides of all the worlds. The water, the ocean went out 30 miles as we saw the waves coming in and going out when you were drinking our horn. If I only would have known, Thor, about your power, I would have been very careful of inviting you here or having you come near my halls. Because when you saw the cat, this was no ordinary cat. This was the Midgard serpent. The Midgard serpent, Jormungandr. And you had taken Jormungandr and you had lifted the Midgard serpent almost to the point where you would have destroyed the whole world itself. That is wrapped around, that she wraps around and bites her own tail, or their own tail. It's neither male nor female. Or maybe Jormungandr is male or is female. Who knows? And then he said to Thor, but most of all, when Ellie came, the old crone, it was time. It was old age itself. And you had to wrestle old age. And you only had one knee down. You almost conquer old age itself, time itself, but no one can conquer time. And we were all the giants in that hall held their breath as you were wrestling with this. And with those words now, Thor, all around him, the clouds were gathering all around him. He felt his electricity. He grabbed the hammer, and within a second, the hammer fell down, but it smashed right onto the ground because Utgard Loki disappeared. His halls disappeared. All they had were the great fields of Jotunheim with the golden oxen. And Thor looked and said, I will be back. I will come back and sort this out. I have been tricked by these giants. And he took the other companions, he found the boat, and soon enough he brought Shalfi and Roskva back to their homestead, and Loki and Thor now flew across the heavens, flew towards Asgard, and there they alighted at home. Right, so the story doesn't quite end I mean, of course they return to Asgard, they return to the homestead of Shalfi and Roskva, but Thor has been tricked, and he's felt the power of the Midgard serpent. He needs to find out its true nature. And with that, he takes coils of rope, and he sits ruminating in Bilskirnir, Thrudheim, where he lives, his great halls of 540 rooms. You see, he's there, but he disguises himself as a young boy, and he goes by himself to the fisherman Hymir, and he's given food and lodging there as a young boy, as he's disguised like I've just described, because he didn't want to reveal his true nature there. And the next day he asked Hymir, can we go fishing? And Hymir says, yes, of course you can, but you need to bring your own bait if you want to come with me. So he goes and takes the head of the great golden oxen that graze in Jotunheim, and he brings it to the boat. And Hymir rows them out into the deepest sea, and he hooks the head and he drops it down onto the seabed, and the rope slackens and he waits. And then a great hunger lives in that sea. A great hunger has been waiting to feast on something like this for maybe thousands of years, because it's been in exile, living on the edges of the world, biting its own tail. It sees the oxen head, it bites deep into it, it gets its hook stuck onto its jaw, and then all the world, particularly our world, Middle Earth, it's starting to rumble, and the seas and the tsunamis and the whirlwinds underneath the sea, everything starts to hang in the balance. The whole world is hanging in the balance as Thor is fishing for the Midgard serpent. And with his strength, his Megan power, and his betrayal by Utgard Loki, he pulls and pulls and pulls the serpent's head, breaks the serpent's water, breaks the surface of the water, and there it stares at Thor, and Thor stares at the serpent, and they are sworn enemies. And just about, the serpent's about to spit its poison onto Thor, and Thor in his rage is about to strike his hammer. But as everything is hanging in the balance, Hymir at that point takes his face is ashen, he's pale, he's afraid, but he takes his knife and he slashes the rope, and the serpent Jormungandr descends down back into the sea. Thor takes out his hammer and hits Hymir on the head. Hymir flies into the water. Many giants don't know how to swim. Often, if they cannot reach the bottom of the sea, they will drown. But under those jagged waves, under that grey water, under the whirlwind, somehow Hymir managed to get himself back on land. He didn't drown that day. Thor, now having felt the surging power, the energy of this serpent, knows what he's up against, and he knows that one day he's going to have to face this serpent for real. Now he goes back to Asgard, but Hymir is furious. Hymir is up in arms. He calls his greatest warrior, his greatest powerful, the most powerful giant, or the strongest giant in Jotunheim, and the name is Hrungnir. Hrungnir can crush mountains with his bare hands, and he's rising from his own
mountain ranges. He's half mountain, half giant. And he's called to Hymir, and Hymir tells him, Hugnir, take the greatest weapon you have, which is a whetstone. Take it and bring it to the land of the gods. Take it with you and go and ask Thor for a duel. Ask him to join you in a duel, because Thor needs to be put in his place. He's coming here to the land of the giants, creating too much trouble. And with that, there was a great duel between Hugnir and Thor. A long, big story of how that took place. But what I want to say is that they did meet, and the hammer, and when they fought, the hammer smashed the whetstone, and piece of the whetstone came into the skull of Thor. And Thor, at the end of this battle, won the duel. But as he came back, he called for the greatest witch of the land of Asgard, Groa, to fix this wound, to try and remove this whetstone from his head. And she sang spells over him. And as she did, the whetstone started to ease. It started to come loose. And then Thor decided, he was so happy with her spells, so happy with the way she was healing him, that he told her that her husband was she had missed her husband for many years, because he's out there traveling between the stars, and her husband was Arvandil, which is the sailor of the stars. And he told her about the beauty of her husband and the great lengths that he travels between the constellations. And he knows her husband well, because when he was in the south of the land of the giants, he'd carried Ervandil behind his back on his backpack. But one of his toes had frozen. Ervandil's toes had frozen, and he had taken off that toe, and he had thrown it into the skies and made the great constellation of Sirius from his toe, one of the stars, the Sirius star. And you can see it, and he showed that constellation to her. That is Arvandil's toe. So with that, we come to the end of the story, and you can see the star glimmering there, and the story of Thor, one out of many.